If you care about how people actually survived war rather than the Hollywood version of it, subscribe to this channel now, because what we're covering today sits at the intersection of military logistics, human endurance, and long-term survival planning. This is not trivia. This is one of the most overlooked yet consequential food technologies of the 20th century. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why modern survivalists still study it. Share this with anyone who claims they're serious about preparedness, because what kept soldiers alive across multiple continents during World War II still matters today. For the first minute, I want to lock your attention with the simple truth that rarely gets discussed. Armies don't win wars on weapons alone. They win on calories, shelf life, transport efficiency, and the brutal reality that food must survive heat, moisture, insects, time, and neglect. During World War II, entire campaigns hinged on whether soldiers could be fed months or even years after production, often in jungles, deserts, or frozen tundra. Among all the innovations of that era, one food stood out for its near-absurd durability. It could last up to 10 years without refrigeration, without preservatives in the modern sense, and without spoiling if stored correctly. That food was hardtack, also known in World War II supply records as pilot bread. Why hardtack became one of the most reliable survival foods ever issued to soldiers. Hardtack was not invented during World War II, but the war proved its unmatched reliability at industrial scale. The recipe was honestly, brutally simple. Just flour, water and salt, baked over and over until almost every trace of moisture was removed. What WWII logistics officers understood, and what many modern survivalists often miss, is that removing moisture is actually more powerful than adding chemicals. Bacteria, mold, and all those spoilage organisms simply cannot function without water. Properly baked hardtack was, in effect, food in a sort of suspended state, nutritionally stable and biologically hostile to decay. During WWII, the United States military issued hardtack extensively in remote theaters where resupply was, uncertain at best. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, where freezing temperatures and humidity absolutely destroyed canned goods, pilot bread became a staple, since it didn't crack under cold, ferment in damp conditions, or collapse during transport. Archaeological finds of sealed World War II-era hardtack have shown it to be, structurally intact even decades later, sometimes still technically edible. So, how did hardtack achieve a shelf life of 10 years without any refrigeration or chemicals? The secret was not magic, and it certainly wasn't guesswork. It was, in fact, physics and microbiology. Hardtack was baked slowly and repeatedly to drive internal moisture below the threshold required for microbial life. Unlike bread meant to be eaten fresh, hardtack was intentionally overbaked to a point of hardness that could honestly crack teeth if eaten improperly. World War II production manuals specified low humidity storage and airtight tins or wax-lined crates, which prevented rehydration from ambient air. This approach gave hardtack an extraordinary shelf life. Stored properly, it could last 5 to 10 years, and sometimes even longer, without the need for refrigeration. That really mattered during wartime, when food had to be produced in bulk, shipped across oceans, stockpiled for future offensives, and issued months after manufacture. How soldiers actually consumed hardtack in real wartime conditions is, well, pretty interesting. Hardtack was never meant to be eaten dry unless it was absolutely necessary. Soldiers would soak it in water, coffee or broth to soften it up a bit. In field kitchens, it was often crumbled into soups or fried in fat when that was available. Some soldiers used it as a thickener for stews, while others combined it with canned meat to create dense, calorie-rich meals that could, really sustain them through long marches. This adaptability was key to its success. Hardtack was not a meal, it was a food platform. It absorbed flavors, liquids and fats, turning scarce resources into filling nourishment. From a survival standpoint, this is critical. A food that can be transformed in multiple ways reduces dependency on variety, which is often the first thing to collapse in prolonged crises. What modern survivalists and historians can still learn from this World War II food? The lesson here is not that you should eat hardtack daily. The lesson is that shelf life, density and versatility matter more than comfort in long-term survival planning. Modern emergency food often relies on complex packaging and supply chains. But, hardtack relied on simplicity and environmental control. If you were to apply this today, you could produce small batches of hardtack using controlled dehydration and store it in airtight containers with desiccants. It becomes a caloric backbone that pairs with modern preserved proteins, dried vegetables or fats. In a grid-down scenario, it functions exactly as it did in World War II. A reliable, predictable source of energy that does not depend on refrigeration. Hardtack really outperformed many other World War II rations over time. Canned foods like corned beef and processed meat were valuable, sure, but they were heavy and, vulnerable to temperature extremes. Fresh bread, on the other hand, would mould quickly. Dehydrated meals needed careful rehydration, and honestly, they just weren't always available early in the war. So, hardtack filled the gap. It was cheap, easy to mass-produce, and, if handled correctly, nearly impossible to spoil. That is why it remained in inventories long after more modern rations were introduced. Logistics officers trusted it, soldiers cursed it, but they survived on it. Why this matters beyond World War II history. Understanding hardtack forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about survival. The foods that keep you alive the longest are rarely the ones designed for comfort. World War II proved that endurance favours simplicity, predictability and respect for basic physical limits. Hardtack was not glamorous, but it worked, and it worked under conditions that broke more complex systems. If this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, subscribe to the channel, share this with fellow historians and survivalists, and stay with us. We don't chase nostalgia here. We study what worked, why it worked, and how it still applies when everything else fails.